Hello and welcome! Today I'm finally back with another editing video and I'm gonna show you how I take a picture like this and how I turn it into a photo like that at the end, while of course as always showing every single step from start to finish. Now, because this picture has such a huge difference in exposure from the very bright sun to the very dark shadows, I had to shoot it in an HDR sequence, so I've got quite a lot of exposures here, but they're really just one f-stop of a difference with each file. So the most important thing before you stitch together your HDR pictures is just to go to any picture in your sequence, go to Develop and down to the lens corrections and click on Remove Chromatic Aberration and also enable Profile Corrections and then choose your lens, in this case just a Canon 18-55 kit lens, and that will just remove all of the chromatic aberration as well as the distortion. So that's a very important thing to do before you stitch together your HDR picture. So then after you've done all of that, you just want to select your picture that you've done the adjustment on, then shift click all the way to the last picture. That will select everything. Then you just want to synchronize all of the settings that you've done. In this case you can just check all because you've just done 2 adjustments, and then synchronize. So that way the distortion as well as the chromatic aberration is gone in all of the pictures. So then you can just grab your sequence, right click, photo merge, HDR, and for you, only a second later, we've got our preview here, and there are also some options, not nearly as many as in some other programs, but the first thing you want to make sure is that you have auto align checked. So that way, if you have a little bit of a difference in the framing of your different exposures, so for example, if you've bumped your tripod just a little bit, it will make sure that it corrects all of that. In any case, you just want to make sure that you have it checked. Then auto tone, really would suggest you to turn that off because it pretty much kind of edits your picture for you in a pretty bad way if you ask me. I really just want the HDR to get a better dynamic range, not to get this kind of crazy look. And then you also have deghost. That way, if something has moved between the exposures, it would kind of eliminate that, at least in theory, but Lightroom really doesn't do a great job, so I would just stick at none no matter what, but especially in a landscape without any movement anyways, just stick with none. And then click on Merge. And once the HDR is created, I've got this one file with all of the dynamic range from all of these previous pictures that I can edit on, and especially in a picture like this where you have such a huge difference in exposure, it can really be useful as you can go into the plus exposure like crazy, as well as in the minus exposure, and still have all of the detail and overall a really good quality. Alright, so finally after all of this, let's get started with the actual editing, and the first thing I'm gonna do is erase the shadows. Here I think about, maybe about plus 40 works quite well. Then I am going to go into the minus highlights just to retrieve all of this detail in the sky and in the cloud. And you know, that's really what HDR is for, to get your dynamic range in that you would otherwise not have, and also readjust the shadows. So already after only 2 adjustments we've got a much better picture, but let's continue. So the whites, they will just increase your overall dynamic of the picture. If I show you an extreme example here, it just looks a little bit more interesting, more, dynamic. But once again, you don't want to go overboard with it. The blacks will just really adjust to very dark blacks, and the shadows will also kind of make your picture more contrasty. Be careful with that though, because it can really ruin the picture. So in this case, I'm actually going to go a bit into the plus. And speaking of contrast, I am going to bring the contrast a little bit to the right, just to give that extra punch. Then let's go to clarity next, and a lot of people would just bring that up no matter what. And even though it can definitely work in some pictures, also try out the minus clarity, because that can also work, especially if you already have so many textures, so many little rocks and everything. It can really be an overload if you go into the plus. As you can see here, it blows your mind with too much texture, too much things going on. So be wary of that, and also go at least try out the minus clarity. and in this case I think about -10 would actually work much better. Then vibrance and saturation, just play around with them, see if it works. Some pictures need it, some pictures don't. And also be sure to play around with both sliders, because sometimes a mixture can work best. But in this case, because it's already pretty colorful, I'm just gonna leave these two at 0 for now. So then let's go into the color temperature, one of the most important adjustments here in the basics tool. And the thing is, even though I like this very warmish look, I don't really want this entire picture to be so warm. So instead of actually just leaving it there or making it even warmer, I am going to go into the blues. And I'm gonna go quite far with them, about 4200 Kelvin here, and even though it might not look as interesting or as pleasing as before, I'm doing that so I get a better starting point to then go down into the split toning, go to the highlights first, just click on this little box. Now what you can do with the split toning highlights is add color to your highlights of the picture. So if I would for example go here into the red tones, as you can see, the sky gets affected like crazy, also all of these highlights, and all of this light that's spilled on the foreground, but the shadows don't really get affected at all. So that's just an extreme example, but a more reasonable and a more realistic one is to go with a mixture between red and kind of yellow, so kind of an orange mixture. And that way, if you don't go overboard with it and just keep the saturation at a reasonable level, you can actually make your picture much more interesting and overall more pleasing. So here's before, here's after, and the immediate difference that you see is obviously in the sky, but also just look at the foreground. Just look at the foreground here. From before to after, it's not huge, but it definitely is a noticeable difference. It makes the entire foreground just that little bit more interesting, that little bit more differentiating. And with the shadows, you have the exact same thing, just with the shadows, but since the color naturally comes from the highlights and the sun and the light sources, this doesn't really have such a huge impact. And let's just go through all of these colors, see if anything works, and sometimes it can actually work to go into kind of a bluish tone. Maybe I'm gonna go into, yeah, kind of a dark blue right here, and really just add a hint of saturation. That way you will get an even bigger color difference from your shadows to your highlights, and from before any split toning to after. Now, once again, it's not huge, but it's supposed to be like that. It's just supposed to enhance the picture and not completely change it. But especially if you look at it, take a while and really look at every detail, you will notice how much more interesting it looks. And it's not so much even about just the color tonality, because there are plenty of other tools that you can change that with. It's more about the differentiation from some of the highlight tones to the shadow tones, and once again from before to after. So then let's go back into the basics adjustments. I always like to do the color temperature and the split toning right away, but I'm gonna go in order after that. But before that, let's just quickly finish the basics adjustments. So the tint right here, yeah, maybe just a little bit more magenta-ish. And after I'm done with all of the adjustments, I just like to look at the picture once again, maybe also take a comparison from the raw file, and just see if there's something that could be changed even more. For example, here the shadows, I think I could raise them a little bit more, while at the same time bringing up the blacks just a hint more, and also reducing the contrast to +10 from +15. Just some little fine tuning. So then, after all of the basics adjustments, I'm gonna go down into the tonal curve. Now, a lot of these names in the tonal curve, for example the highlights and the shadows, you already have that up here, and honestly I don't think Lightroom is doing really a favor to its community by naming it the same thing, because it's very confusing, especially if you're just starting. But with the shadows, alright, so the shadows in the basics adjustments, if I move them around, you can see they really change the entire dark portions, pretty much in this case, because everything is so dark and except for the sky, it changes most of the picture in a very severe way. But the shadows in the tonal curve, they will just change the very dark blacks and the very dark shadows. So you can see it's a very big difference from the shadows down here to the shadows in the basics adjustments. And the same is true with the highlights as well. So here in the basics, the highlight slider will just adjust the bright parts of your picture in a very broad way, whereas the highlights in the tonal curve will just kind of pick out the very bright spots and adjust them respectively. So that's just something to be aware of, because a lot of people will skip ahead thinking they've already adjusted the highlight slider, but they do very different things, and once again, really wish Adobe would name them differently. But let's get into the actual highlight slider in the tonal curve, and most of the cases I like to bring that one up, but here it doesn't really work. So here from 0, mainly look at the sky for that, to upwards about 65, it really doesn't help the picture. It makes everything kind of too bright, too harsh, don't like it. So let's try the opposite and bring it down, and look at that, that really works. It makes the sky more soft and more silky. I do like that look very much, so let's bring that down by around 70. And to the light slider, this is just kind of an in-between of the highlights in the tonal curve and the highlights in the basic adjustments, so just be sure to play around with it. There's not really an option or a setting that I could recommend to you, because every single picture is different with that, and the exact same thing is true also with the darks. So then let's go into the shadows and get done with the tonal curve. Maybe I am actually going to bring them up just a bit, and also you would have point curve where you could change the overall contrast, but here it just adds too much contrast. So here is before any tonal curve adjustments, here's afterwards. Not a huge difference, but it does help the picture and I like it a bit better. So then let's go into the Hsl tool. Now Hsl tool doesn't have a huge impact, so let's just quickly cover it. The hue right here, what I like to do is go to the little pinpointer right next to it and click on it, then drag it over to a major color in the picture, hold down the left mouse and go up and down, and that way it will adjust the color tonality in the amount of the color that is actually in the picture. So once again, not a huge deal, and I'm just gonna do it very quickly here. You can also do that with other colors, mostly major colors that you have in your picture. So for example, the blues right here, make this a bit more, well, a bit more light bluish, and then do the exact same thing with the saturation. Also grab the little pinpointer right there and just fine adjust the actual colors, and also do the same thing with the luminance. So once again, not a huge thing, and also you can only really do that with the major colors in your picture, as you only have all of these sliders, so you can't really change a certain hue of green. Green is pretty much green, and that is it. But you know, from before to after, a little bit of a change. Then let's go down, and split toning, already covered that. Now detail is very important, both if you want to print your picture of course, but actually also if you want to display it online. So what I would suggest you to do here is just zoom in 1 to 1, and here let's just go to any area really and bring up the sharpening. This will make your picture a little bit more sharp, more crisp, and especially if you're working with a pretty bad lens such as the kit lens as I shot this picture with right here, it can really work to add some sharpness. And after you've added the sharpness, you want to make sure that you zoom out again, hold down the masking slider while holding down the Alt key or CMD key on a Mac, and bring that one to the right. Now everything that is white means that it's gonna get sharpened, and everything that is black means that it doesn't get sharpened. This is important because you don't want to have the non-textured surfaces sharpened, as there isn't really any texture to be sharpened. It will just increase the noise. So just bring that to the right a little bit, so most of the sky, most of the water isn't selected. Doesn't have to be perfect, but it's good to do. Alright, so then let's zoom in 1 to 1 again. And if you have a ton of noise in your picture, you can bring up the noise reduction, But if you watch this in full HD, just looking very closely to this rock right here, as I bring that up even to about 20, it will just make the entire picture much more soft, much more plasticky. It loses a ton of detail, and honestly, don't use it unless you absolutely have to, unless you absolutely have a ton of noise in your photo. Otherwise, it's not worth the compromise, in my opinion. But going to the color slider, this really should be named color noise reduction if you ask me, because what this will do is get rid of the purple and green center noise in your picture. And other than the noise reduction, it doesn't have any bad impact whatsoever. So just go ahead and bring that all the way to the right. And I'm not sure how well you're gonna be able to see that in a video after compression and everything, but I can tell you in person it looks much cleaner afterwards. And this is especially if you've never used it before, you won't even think about it, you won't even really notice that there is any color noise until you see the difference from before to after. It's really quite amazing what it can do, and if that's still not enough, once again in a very noisy picture, you could also bring up the smoothness, but here it's definitely enough with 100. Going down to the lens corrections, of course we've already adjusted all of that beforehand before merging together the HDR, but if you're just working with a regular RAW file, then this is a great time to also remove the chromatic aberration and enable the profile corrections. And by the way, you can also go into manual and even go and fine-tune the amount of defringing, but it's really not needed in most cases. So just clicking these two boxes will do the job most of the time. And going down to the transform, we're getting quite close to the end of the global adjustments at least, but the transform tool itself, it's not really useful for landscapes at all pretty much, because what you can do here, yeah, I kind of messed up the picture completely, but what this is meant for is to straighten the lines and the angles of houses and architecture and stuff like that. So use it for that, but for a landscape or nature picture, just move on, don't even bother with it. And down here at effects, there is actually a thing that I really love, and that is called vignetting. Now, plus exposure vignetting will just ruin your picture, so don't even try it. But going into the minus exposure can actually work a lot of the times. Because if I show you the extreme example here, of course vignetting will just add a kind of vignette of minus exposure over your corners of the picture. And that way, if you do it in a reasonable amount, it can help to set the mood, get more attention towards the center and less attention towards the edges. So once again, you don't want to go minus 100, but if you do it reasonably, for example in this case about minus 14, and then also fine adjust the midpoint as well as the feather, it can actually benefit your picture quite a bit. So here's before, here's after, a little bit more interesting. Let's also quickly cover grain. This will just make your picture grainy. Don't use it unless you want to go for a vintage look. And of course dehaze, if you would have a very hazy picture and you don't want to work with the mood of that haze, you can go into the plus here and make your picture a little bit less hazy. So let's go into the camera calibration, which is finally our last global adjustment. And the first thing that is the most important thing that you have here is profile. And you just want to go through all of these profiles and see for yourself which one works the best. Because this is a thing that really depends on the picture, your preference. There's no way for me to tell what you should do here, except for going through all of them and seeing for yourself what you like best. But what this pretty much does is change your profile, adjust the color, your lighting, and just your overall look of the picture a little bit. So Adobe standard is a little bit flat perhaps. A camera landscape is usually the most vibrant one, and I'm not sure here. Yeah, I think I'm actually gonna go with camera landscape. It's a little bit more interesting, a little bit more dynamic, and I do think it works for this kind of picture. But anyways, then you have the primary color sliders, and they will change, well, the primary color. But a thing to be aware of here is that if you change the red hue, for example, you will also change all of the other hues of the green tones, of the blue tones, and the same is true with all of these other colors. So just play around with them once again, stick with whatever you like best, and then of course also play around with the saturation itself. But this doesn't have a huge impact, and it's definitely more about the fine-tuning rather than the very rudimentary adjustments. But as we're in a very long and in-depth tutorial, why not also cover that one? So with the blues, maybe gonna bring that, well, maybe actually bring that a little bit towards the minus, and with the saturation, yeah, let's actually bring that one up by a bit. And from before any camera calibration adjustments to after, it's a notable difference, not a huge thing, but it does fine-tune your picture by a bit. So we're finally done with the global adjustments. Let's quickly see from before to after, and already quite a big difference, but of course there are still the local adjustments to be done. And the first thing I always like to start out with the local adjustments is the graduated filter, and you want to use that for any large adjustments on your picture. So the first thing I'm gonna do here is go and grab a graduated filter over the bottom and add some minus exposure. So as you see here from before, the entire foreground looks a little bit too even for me, and going into the minus exposure just for the very bottom here really helps me to lead into the picture and create interest in terms of the exposure differentiation. And I'm just gonna fine tune that, maybe even grab another filter, also go into the minus exposure, and just go over the very bottom down here. That way you can fine tune your graduation. You can even go crazy and take another one and go over the very bottom. Just be sure to have a very soft feather if you do all of that. And another thing that I like to use that for is to grab a very big one with a very soft feather and pretty much put it over the entire half of the picture where the light is coming from, and just add a little bit of white, add a little bit of plus exposure, you know, really just a hint. And from before any graduated filters to after, before it was already pretty good, but the bottom was a bit distracting, and afterwards it's not only not distracting anymore, but it also added a little bit of exposure difference and pronounced all of that from the bottom right here to the sun and the entire sky portion. So with that being said, I think I'm done in terms of the graduated filters for exposure, but I am going to add a few other ones for color. So what I mean with that is that the sky, the sun of course, the forest is relatively warm, and it works great that way. But it could work if I would just add another graduated filter over the bottom here, and instead maybe go into the color and just add a bit of blue, really just a hint once again, and maybe even go into the color temperature and make the entire color temperature down here a bit cooler. So let's just see from before that one filter to after. It's not a big difference, but it does help in terms of complexity and differentiation. So in a lot of other pictures you could go way farther and create even different filters. A thing that I just thought about is to add another filter over the sky, this time a relatively small one, and go into a little bit of a different color hue. So let's just see what would work here, perhaps even, yeah, a bit of magenta reddish color, and just add a bit of saturation, not go crazy there. And from before that one to after, it does look a little bit more differentiating and a bit more interesting if you ask me. So I don't want to go too much in depth and too crazy with that because there are so many different options, and I think just showing you that you can do all of that is the most important thing, rather than to get the perfect picture at the end. From before any graduated filter adjustments to afterwards. As for the next thing, we've got the adjustment brush, and the adjustment brush I don't really use too much, mainly for additional minus vignetting. If you want to do that in just certain corners, just be sure to have the feather at 100, also the flow at 100. auto mask turned off, otherwise it will try to automatically figure out what it wants to select in a very unnatural way. And yeah, maybe just here a little bit more vignetting, great way to just fine-tune everything. But other than that, I don't like the adjustment brush too much. Alright, so let's get into the final local adjustment, which is the rail filter, and I absolutely love that filter. So I use the rail filters for once to add dodge and burning, which is making individual parts of the picture either darker or brighter, but also to increase the diversity in terms of the color, just very similar to the graduated filter, but you have much more control here. So let's get started with the dodge and burning. So first of all, I'm gonna go into the plus whites, plus exposure, maybe a little bit into the minus contrast, mix that with a bit of warmth in the color temperature, and just create a filter right here. And you want to make sure that you invert the mask, otherwise everything outside of the filter will get affected. And you also want to make sure that you bring the feather all the way to 100. So then, let me just show you quickly the extreme example. If I go crazily into the plus exposure, you can see the only adjustment is really towards the center. All of the very big area around it is just the graduation from the effect to the rest of the picture. And this is also why you want to bring the feather to 100, because as I bring that down, it becomes more and more harsh, and eventually at 0 it is just a circle. So just bring that to 100, it looks the best by far. So let's bring down the exposure to a more feasible level. And in terms of dodge and burning, you just want to go over your kind of boring and already bright spots and just exaggerate that look there and add some additional exposure. So once you've added one filter, you can right click duplicate and drag that filter over another spot. So that is why I love the rail filters over the adjustment brush for the dodge and burning, because it's just so fast, so easy. And with every single filter you have complete independent control over all of these sliders, so you can just adjust the slider for this filter without affecting any of the other ones. And once again, right click duplicate. Now I don't think this picture really needs too much dodge and burning, just a little few spots right here and right there, but you can definitely go crazy. I've made a completely separate tutorial about dodge and burning as well, because there are so many possibilities for that. But let me just add another few ones right here, just maybe another one on the tree. You know, it kind of looks a bit boring from before, so just want to exaggerate and enhance that a bit. And yeah, I think that should pretty much do the job. Then let's do the exact same thing, just with minus exposure. So here, minus exposure, minus blacks, and a little bit into the plus contrast. And it is important that you also do that, because you don't just want plus exposure. You also want some parts of the picture being dark. That creates differentiation, that creates interest. And as long as you don't go overboard with it, it will still keep on looking natural. So right click duplicate, go over this part right here, make it a bit darker. Also do the same thing right there. And it doesn't really matter if you stack some of the filters over a part of the previous one. Again, the actual effect is much smaller than the filter looks to be. And I think that for this picture there are quite a lot of opportunities for minus exposure, because a lot of these little rocks and these little, you know, just stones can really benefit from it. And let's add, you know, actually a pretty big one over here. Just make this part a bit darker. It's very important to have some differentiation and not just everything very bright. So that is why I'm doing that right here. And perhaps even go over this side. So now you also have a differentiation just within this little part of this rock, from the left being relatively, you know, bright to the right getting gradually darker. There is so much you can do, so many possibilities. and there is definitely a lot of opportunity for dodge and burning filters. But let's keep it at least somewhat concise, if you can even call it that. But I think it's, it's interesting if you're new to Lightroom, if you just want to learn some new stuff. That way I can really explain everything in detail and go over every single tool, rather than just show you the editing, but also explain everything in depth. But with that being said, I'm close to being done with the dodge and burning. So let's just right click and duplicate and perhaps bring one over this part as well. So now from before any dodge and burning to after, I love that look. It really is very subtle, but it does help it so much. It does make it look so much more interesting. And dodge and burning, it's really all about enhancing what you already have rather than going in a completely different direction. So, this was just kind of a bit flat in comparison to after the dodge and burning. But with that being said, I'm not completely done with the rail filters yet, because I'm also going to change up the color of certain spots. So for that, I'm going to reset all of the exposure adjustments and just go into the color. And for first of all, I'm just gonna grab a blue hue right here and look at the sky, for example. Now, I think the sky looks great and it's very colorful, but if you look closely, you might find opportunity for a change in hue in just some certain parts. And here, I do think that the right part of the sky was just a little bit too even, a little bit too boring. So let's just add a filter right here with a bit of a different blue hue and just add a bit here and maybe right click and duplicate that one actually and just bring it up over here, just the very top. Now let's go over there and also make that a bit more bluish. And there are pictures where there's really a ton of opportunity for that, mainly if you have really a ton of water or sky. But in this case, there isn't really too much of that, so the actual opportunities are limited. But let's actually add a smaller one just right here and go into the color and just add a bit of a different orange hue. So there's also some differentiation within the sun to the outskirts of the sun. Maybe I even want to add some white additionally to that. But I'm gonna say that I'm done with the rail filters. Here is before any, here's afterwards. Looks great in my opinion. But a thing that I just wanna, a thing that I always like to do at the end is just go over the entire picture after all of the editing, after I pretty much think that I'm done, and just look at it and see if there is some opportunity for some further adjustments, fine-tuning some of the previously adjusted sliders. So in this case, I do want to go back to the vibrance and saturation real quick and just see if there's opportunity for that. Maybe not, maybe even a little bit into the minus saturation, and in exchange go into the plus vibrance. Yeah, I do actually think that works a bit better. And also a thing that I've noticed is that this path right here with all of these rocks, all of these stones look still a little bit too textured. So I'm gonna grab an adjustment brush, go into the minus clarity and brush over this path right here. Once again, clarity into the minus can really help to decrease the clutteredness in textures. And from this very small adjustment to afterwards, it is a little bit more pleasing for the overall picture. So let's see, is there opportunity for anything else? Maybe another graduated filter with even more minus exposure over the very bottom right here. And I really want a very big differentiation from this very bottom being very dark to the medium dark, medium bright, very bright, and so on. And as a very last thing, I'm gonna bring down the overall contrast even more and also bring up the shadows in the tonal curve a little bit, and in exchange bring down the blacks a bit further. Alright, I'm gonna say that I'm done with the entire picture here. Let's look at the history and see where we started out with the HDR file. Now this is a huge difference of course, but it pretty much is the same as a RAW file, just the only difference is that it has a much greater dynamic range. And afterwards, you know, even though it might look a little bit HDR-ish, you know, there's definitely some further fine adjustment to be done, and I would always recommend just to go away from your computer and go back after 5 minutes or so and take another look at your picture, because a lot of times stuff can change and sometimes you see something that you didn't before. But, you know, this is mainly a Lightroom tutorial and mainly to show you what you can do with a picture and not so much about the actual result at the end. But of course, if you don't like it as, you know, vibrant, as overdone perhaps, then you can just go into the sliders and move them half or a quarter as much as I have done here. That's been it for today, and if you're still here listening to what I say after this crazy long video, then you must be very, very dedicated to learning Lightroom stuff, and hopefully that means that it's been informative and interesting enough to stick around so long. So thank you very much for that, much appreciated. But by the way, the last couple of weeks I haven't really made any videos. That is because my voice was completely messed up. I got sick and then my voice just sounded like a squeaking door for a couple of weeks. But I'm back and I'm gonna keep on making videos. So yeah, I'm gonna peace out, keep on taking pictures and have a wonderful day.